I'm Amelia, 35, with an MBA and years of industry experience my family business desperately needed. When my grandfather Edward founded our precision manufacturing company, he always told me I had the mind for business. But when I applied, my Uncle Harold's words cut deep. You're not qualified to work here. Family or not. He had no idea I'd soon be managing their $60 million contract at my new company. Sometimes rejection leads you exactly where you need to be. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been underestimated. My grandfather Edward was a visionary. In 1965, with just 2 machines in a small warehouse, he founded Hartwell Precision Manufacturing. I grew up hearing stories about how he worked 18-hour days, sleeping on a cot in the back office, determined to build something that would last generations. By the time I was born, the company had grown into a respected regional supplier for automotive and aerospace industries, with over 100 employees and a reputation for excellence. Some of my earliest memories are of company picnics at the lakeside park near our facility. I remember racing between tables of employees who would ruffle my hair and tell me how much I looked like my grandfather. "She's got his eyes," they'd say. And his determination, my grandfather would add with pride. I loved visiting my father Lawrence's office after school, drawing at his conference table while he finished his work. The manufacturing floor fascinated me with its precise choreography of machines and people creating components that would eventually fly in airplanes or drive in luxury vehicles. The smell of metal and industrial lubricant became comforting, familiar. When I was 12, my grandfather started taking me on personal tours, explaining processes and business decisions. "You've got the mind for business, Amelia," he'd tell me. "You ask the right questions." He'd quiz me on efficiency improvements or material choices, beaming when I suggested solutions that matched his thinking. I treasured those moments, storing away his wisdom like precious gems. Then came the darkest day. I was 14 when my grandfather suffered a massive heart attack at his desk. The business passed to his 3 sons, my father Lawrence, my uncle Harold, and my uncle Walter. Though the ownership was initially equal, Harold had always been the most aggressive, the most like my grandfather in his business drive, if not his compassion. Within 2 years, Harold had maneuvered himself into majority control. He convinced Walter to sell him some shares during a personal financial crisis. He diluted my father's influence by bringing in outside investors aligned with his vision. Gradually, my father found himself sidelined to less critical operations while Harold took the helm. Despite this family drama playing out in boardrooms and hushed conversations behind closed doors, I remained determined to honor my grandfather's legacy. I chose my college education specifically for industry relevance, majoring in business administration with minors in engineering and supply chain management. I graduated with honors, then immediately pursued my MBA from a prestigious university, focusing on manufacturing strategy. For 5 years after graduation, I worked at competitor firms, learning best practices and modern techniques our family business hadn't yet adopted. I developed expertise in lean manufacturing, digital integration, and sustainable production methods. I built a professional reputation separate from my family name, proving myself on merit alone. When I felt ready, I returned home with innovative ideas for modernizing our family business. Though Harold had improved revenues, the company hadn't evolved with industry trends. Its processes remained largely unchanged since my grandfather's day, and I knew we risked falling behind more nimble competitors. My father quietly encouraged my ambition but warned me about Harold. "He sees threats everywhere," Lawrence cautioned over coffee in his modest home office, surrounded by family photos and mementos from his increasingly marginalized role. "And he's especially sensitive about your relationship with Dad." I spent weeks creating a detailed business improvement plan, analyzing our competitive landscape and identifying opportunities for growth. I scheduled meetings with industry contacts who could provide testimonials about my capabilities. I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. The opportunity I'd like to apply, I said confidently. The table fell silent. My father studied his plate. Aunt Margaret looked uncomfortably between Harold and me. After a pause that stretched like taffy, Harold nodded. Sure, Amelia. Send your resume to HR and we'll set up an interview. I spent the next week in a state of nervous excitement, updating my resume, selecting the perfect interview outfit, and refining my presentation. This was my chance to prove myself, to honor my grandfather's faith in me, and to help secure our family legacy for generations to come. The night before my interview, my mother squeezed my hand. He would be so proud of you, she said, and we both knew she meant my grandfather. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that. I fell asleep, imagining my office at Hartwell Precision, planning the family photos I would display alongside my grandfather's portrait. In my dreams, I stood beside him on the manufacturing floor, both of us nodding in satisfaction at improvements I'd implemented, his hand warm on my shoulder. The Hartwell Precision Manufacturing headquarters had been renovated since my childhood visits. The reception area now featured sleek leather furniture and a wall displaying the company's awards and certifications. What caught my attention immediately were the family photos prominently displayed behind the reception desk. My grandfather with Harold. Harold with his children. Walter with his family. Conspicuously absent was any image including my father or our branch of the family. The receptionist, Jenna, glanced. I sat in the waiting area, reviewing my notes one last time. Other employees walked through, some nodding politely, others watching with curious eyes. I recognized a few from company events, but most were strangers, hired after Harold had taken control. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. My palms grew sweaty as I checked my watch repeatedly. Finally, Jenna announced that they were ready for me. The conference room felt cavernous, with just 4 people in it. Harold sat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 board members I recognized as his longtime allies, Franklin Peters and Douglas Reed. No sign of my father or Walter, despite both technically being on the board. Amelia, Harold said without rising. Thank you for your interest in joining Hartwell Precision. The formality stung. This was my uncle, who had once pushed me on the swings at family gatherings. Now he regarded me with the cool assessment of a stranger. What followed was a 45-minute interrogation designed to undermine rather than evaluate. Every accomplishment on my resume was questioned. My experience at competitor firms was framed as limited exposure rather than valuable outside perspective. My ideas for modernization were dismissed as theoretical rather than practical. When I began my prepared presentation, Harold interrupted after the second slide. I think we've seen enough, he said, closing my portfolio folder. Amelia, you have an impressive academic background, but Hartwell Precision needs leadership with hands-on manufacturing experience at the executive level. I have 5 years of direct industry experience, I countered, fighting to keep my voice steady. And specific training in exactly the operational development this position requires. Harold's smile didn't reach his eyes. Not at the level we need. This isn't an entry-level position. I'm not applying for an entry-level position, I said. I'm applying based on my qualifications, which match or exceed your job description requirements. Franklin Peters cleared his throat. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we have candidates with 10 to 15 years of senior management experience. The rejection landed like a physical blow. You're not qualified to work here, Harold said with finality. Family or not. I gathered my materials with shaking hands, thanked them mechanically for their time, and walked out with my head high despite the burning behind my eyes. In the hallway, I nearly collided with my cousin Bradley, Harold's son, who was waiting outside. Sorry about that, Amelia, he said, looking genuinely uncomfortable. Dad's been stressed about this position. Before I could respond, Harold called from inside. Bradley, come in. We need to discuss the director position with you. My stomach dropped. Bradley had only completed his bachelor's degree the previous year. The 10 to 15 years of senior management experience requirement apparently didn't apply to Harold's son. That evening, my parents had already planned a family dinner, expecting to celebrate my new position. Instead, I had to recount my humiliation while picking at my mother's roast chicken. The table sat heavy with uncomfortable silence. "I'm sure they had their reasons," my mother finally offered. "Maybe it just wasn't the right fit." "The right fit was Bradley," I said. "He got the director position, with his bachelor's degree and zero industry experience." My father's fork clattered against his plate. I nodded, fighting tears. My father's face darkened, but he said nothing more. Later that evening, as I helped clear the dishes, I overheard my mother in hushed conversation with my Aunt Gloria, Walter's wife, who had called to check in. "It's just another way to keep Lawrence's branch out of key decisions," Gloria was saying through the speakerphone. "Walter sees what's happening but feels powerless to stop it." After my mother hung up, my father joined me on the back porch, where I was nursing a glass of wine and watching fireflies punctuate the darkness. "Your grandfather always saw something special in you," he said quietly. "Harold resented that. Even when you were young, he noticed how Edward would light up when talking about your potential." "So this is just decades-old jealousy?" I asked bitterly. "It's more complicated than that," my father sighed. "Harold believes he saved the company after Dad died. In his mind, he deserves total control. Anyone who challenges that narrative becomes a threat." That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and questioned everything. My qualifications, my career choices, my worth. The pain wasn't just professional rejection, it was family betrayal, cutting deeper than any corporate dismissal ever could. The next morning, my mother tried to smooth things over with false brightness. "There are plenty of other opportunities out there for someone with your talents," she said, placing a cup of coffee in front of me. But her divided loyalty was clear. She wanted peace in the family above all else, even if it meant accepting Harold's decision. Even my father, though sympathetic, seemed resigned to Harold's control. Years of being sidelined had worn down his will to fight. I felt utterly alone in my sense of injustice. The family business that had shaped my entire educational and career path had rejected me, not based on merit, but on internal politics and ancient grudges. What hurt most was realizing that no one was willing to challenge the status quo, to stand up and say that what happened was wrong. For a week after the rejection, I barely left my apartment. I alternated between anger, humiliation, and a bone-deep sadness that made even simple tasks feel monumental. My phone rang repeatedly with family members checking in, but I let most calls go to voicemail, unable to bear more platitudes or awkward attempts at consolation. Finally, I agreed to meet my friend Samantha for coffee. We'd been roommates in college, and she had built a successful career in marketing, completely independent of family connections. Her perspective was exactly what I needed. "So they rejected you for lack of experience, but gave the job to your cousin who has even less," she clarified, stirring her latte. "That's not about qualifications, Amelia. That's politics." "Family politics," I corrected bitterly. "Still politics," she insisted. "And you know what? Thank goodness they showed their true colors before you joined. Can you imagine working in that environment every day?" Her words shifted something in me. I'd been so focused on the rejection that I hadn't considered what accepting the position might have actually meant. Would I have been constantly undermined? Relegated to meaningless projects? Forever in Harold's shadow? "You're too good for that," Samantha continued. "Your grandfather saw your potential because it was real. Don't let Harold make you question that." That evening, I opened my laptop and began job hunting in earnest. I updated my LinkedIn profile, reached out to my professional network, and researched companies that might value my specific expertise. The action itself was healing, redirecting my energy from dwelling on rejection to creating new possibilities. 3 weeks into my search, I received a call from Gabriel Ramirez, a former colleague from my previous job. "Amelia, perfect timing. My company is looking for a vendor relations manager with manufacturing expertise. Interested in an interview? Gabriel worked for Morgan Industries, a company I knew by reputation as a growing player in commercial aviation components. What I didn't know then was the connection that would soon change everything. The interview with Morgan's department head, Thomas Wilson, was everything my Hartwell interview wasn't. He asked thoughtful questions about my experience, engaged with my ideas, and seemed genuinely interested in my perspective on industry trends. When I mentioned my family business background without specifics, he nodded appreciatively. That kind of institutional knowledge is valuable, he said. You understand the challenges from both sides of the vendor relationship. 2 days later, I received a job offer with a salary that exceeded my expectations and responsibilities that perfectly matched my qualifications. I accepted immediately, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. This was a chance to prove myself on neutral ground, away from family dynamics and historical baggage. My first day orientation at Morgan Industries included the standard procedures, badge photos, benefits enrollment, and a tour of the facility. As my department coordinator, Heather, walked me through the company's vendor management system, a familiar name caught my eye on the client list, Hartwell Precision Manufacturing. Is that a current vendor? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. One of our biggest, Heather confirmed. They supply about 40% of our precision components. Been with us for years. My stomach tightened. Morgan Industries wasn't just any company, it was my family business's largest client. The contract would be worth millions annually, and now I would potentially be involved in managing that relationship. That evening, I considered my options carefully. The ethical course was clear. I needed to disclose my connection. But would it cost me this new opportunity? After a restless night, I scheduled a meeting with Morgan's HR director, Patricia. I should inform you that Hartwell Precision is my family's business, I explained. My father and uncles own it, though I have no financial stake myself. Patricia looked concerned, but not alarmed. I appreciate your transparency, Amelia. Let me discuss this with legal and Thomas. The next day, Thomas called me into his office. Patricia told me about your family connection to Hartwell. I appreciate your honesty. I nodded, bracing for bad news. We don't see it as a disqualifying conflict, provided you can maintain professional boundaries, he continued. Actually, your insider knowledge could be valuable. But we'll need to establish clear protocols for any direct dealings with them. Relief washed over me. I can absolutely maintain professional boundaries, I assured him. What I didn't say was how easy that would be given my current relationship with Harold. Over the next several months, I immersed myself in learning Morgan's systems and processes. I focused on other vendor relationships, resolving issues that had plagued the procurement department for months. My attention to detail and understanding of manufacturing constraints helped me bridge communication gaps between our engineers and suppliers. You've got a knack for this, Thomas commented during a project review. You speak both languages, technical and business. His words echoed my grandfather's long-ago praise, and I felt a surge of validation. Here, my qualifications weren't questioned. My contributions were valued on their merits, not filtered through family history or personal agendas. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt I was exactly where I belonged professionally. The irony wasn't lost on me that Harold's rejection had led directly to this opportunity. Had he accepted me at Hartwell, I would never have discovered this role where I could truly thrive. As my confidence grew, so did my sense of identity separate from the Hartwell name. I was building relationships and reputation based solely on my own work. The pain of rejection gradually faded, replaced by genuine enthusiasm for my new path. What I didn't yet realize was how directly that path would intersect with Hartwell Precision again, and how completely the power dynamic was about to shift. 6 months into my position at Morgan Industries, Thomas scheduled my performance review. I entered his office with confidence, knowing I had exceeded expectations in several areas. Amelia, I'll cut to the chase, Thomas began, reviewing my file. Your work has been exceptional. You've resolved long-standing issues with 3 key vendors, improved delivery metrics across the board, and introduced accountability measures that have already saved us considerable time and money. I thanked him, trying not to appear too pleased. Which brings me to a new opportunity, he continued. We're entering our annual contract renewal evaluation phase. I'd like you to lead the assessment for our top 5 vendors. My heart skipped. Including Hartwell Precision? Thomas nodded. Especially Hartwell. Their contract is our largest at nearly $60 million annually. And between us, there have been some concerns about their performance lately. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a preliminary report showing declining metrics across several categories for Hartwell Precision. My stomach tightened as I scanned the numbers. Quality control issues? I asked, noting several flagged shipments. Increasing rejections over the past 10 months, Thomas confirmed, along with delivery delays affecting our production schedules. And their costs have crept up above industry standards without corresponding value improvements. I stared at the data, a mixture of emotions churning inside me. Professional concern about the metrics, personal disappointment in the company's decline, and if I'm honest, a tiny spark of satisfaction that Harold's leadership wasn't as flawless as he claimed. I understand this puts you in a delicate position, Thomas said. If you'd prefer to recuse yourself from the Hartwell evaluation, I can assign it to someone else. I considered this for a moment. Recusing myself would be the easy path. But it would also reinforce the notion that I couldn't separate personal relationships from professional responsibilities, exactly what Harold had implied during my rejection. I can handle it, I said firmly, with complete objectivity and transparency. Over the next 2 weeks, I dove deep into Hartwell's performance data. The picture that emerged was troubling. Quality issues had begun shortly after Bradley took over as Director of Operational Development. Delivery timelines had stretched from 2 weeks to nearly a month. Cost increases outpaced inflation and material price fluctuations. I scheduled a meeting with Gabriel, who had worked directly with Hartwell representatives for several years. They've been coasting on their reputation, he confirmed. The last 3 meetings, Harold sent junior staff instead of coming himself. And they keep promising improvements that never materialize. Have we explored alternative vendors? I asked. Gabriel nodded. For some components, yes. But a complete transition would take at least 6 months of qualification testing and process validation. It's not impossible, but it would be disruptive. Next, I met with Caroline Winters, a senior director who had become something of a mentor to me. I needed ethical guidance from someone with more experience. The data speaks for itself, she said after reviewing my findings. Your job is to present that data objectively and make recommendations based on business factors, not personal ones. The fact that you're related to Hartwell's ownership doesn't change the numbers. Before proceeding further, I scheduled another meeting with Thomas to ensure complete transparency. I want to confirm you're comfortable with me leading this review, I said. The data shows significant issues that will need to be addressed with Hartwell. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Are you concerned about being tough on your family? I shook my head. I'm concerned about the perception if I recommend contract modification or termination. I want to ensure my analysis is beyond reproach. He smiled slightly. That's exactly why you're the right person for this. Document everything meticulously, follow our standard evaluation protocol to the letter, and let the data drive your recommendations. I'll back you completely. With Thomas's support, I conducted a comprehensive audit of Hartwell's performance across all contract parameters. I analyzed 3 years of data to establish trends. I interviewed our production managers about the operational impact of Hartwell's issues. I compiled alternative vendor information, including transition costs and timelines. The results were undeniable. Hartwell's performance had degraded significantly, particularly in the 18 months since Bradley's promotion. They were now in the bottom quartile of our vendor rankings, despite charging premium prices. As I prepared my presentation for the vendor review meeting, my phone rang with my father's number. Amelia, he sounded concerned. Harold mentioned that Morgan Industries has been requesting unusual amounts of performance data. Are you involved in that? I took a deep breath. Dad, I can't discuss specifics of my work. But yes, I'm involved in vendor relationship management at Morgan. A long pause followed. Harold doesn't know you work there, does he? I don't believe so, I admitted. It hasn't come up in family conversations, and I haven't had direct contact with Hartwell representatives yet. This could get complicated, my father warned. Only if Hartwell isn't meeting its contractual obligations, I replied. This is business, Dad. Not personal. But as I hung up, I wondered if that was entirely true. Was some part of me looking forward to confronting Harold from a position of power? Was I seeking some form of vindication? I spent that evening reviewing my presentation again, scrutinizing every data point and recommendation for any hint of bias. This wasn't about revenge. It was about doing my job with integrity, the way my grandfather would have expected. By the time I finalized my slides, I was confident in both my analysis and my motives. The vendor review meeting was scheduled for the following week. Hartwell Precision would be sending their executive team to discuss the contract renewal. And for the first time since my rejection, I would face Harold across a conference table. But this time, the power dynamics would be very different. I arrived at the conference room an hour early to prepare. Our procurement team had set up refreshments and arranged seating with care. My presentation was loaded on the main screen, the agenda printed for each attendee. I reviewed my talking points one last time, focusing on maintaining professional detachment regardless of how Hartwell's representatives might react. At precisely 10 o'clock, our receptionist announced the arrival of the Hartwell team. I stood at the head of the table, outwardly calm despite my racing heart. The door opened, and Harold entered first, followed by Bradley and two other Hartwell executives I didn't recognize. The moment Harold saw me, he stopped abruptly. Bradley nearly collided with him from behind. Amelia? Harold's confusion quickly morphed into suspicion. What are you doing here? I extended my hand professionally. Good morning, Mr. Hartwell. I'm Amelia Hartwell, Vendor Relations Manager at Morgan Industries. I'll be leading our contract review discussion today. Harold didn't take my offered hand. This is irregular. We typically meet with Thomas Wilson for contract discussions. Mr. Wilson will join us later, I explained. As our vendor relationship manager, I handle the preliminary review and recommendations. Bradley looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. The other Hartwell executives seemed confused by the tension. Please have a seat, I gestured to the chairs. We have a full agenda to cover. Harold reluctantly sat down, his eyes never leaving my face. I wasn't aware you had taken a position with Morgan. I've been here for 8 months, I replied evenly. Now, if we could begin with our performance evaluation findings. I launched into my presentation, displaying graphs that clearly showed Hartwell's declining performance metrics. Quality control issues were highlighted in red, delivery delays in orange, cost overruns in purple. The data was comprehensive and damning. This is absurd, Harold interrupted halfway through. These metrics are cherry-picked to create a negative impression. This is clearly a personal vendetta. I maintained my composure. Every metric shown is drawn directly from our standard vendor evaluation protocol. The same standards apply to all our suppliers. I continued with specific examples: shipments rejected due to dimensional inconsistencies, delivery dates missed by weeks, price increases implemented without corresponding value improvements. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat as I detailed issues that had begun shortly after his promotion. The other Hartwell executives were taking notes furiously, occasionally exchanging concerned glances. Morgan Industries has valued its relationship with Hartwell Precision, I concluded. However, these performance issues cannot continue if we are to maintain our business relationship. Harold stood abruptly. This presentation is biased and unprofessional. I'll be discussing this directly with Thomas. Mr. Wilson is fully aware of my findings, I replied calmly. In fact, here he is now. Thomas entered the room, nodding professionally to everyone. I see Amelia has shared our concerns about recent performance issues. Thomas, Harold said immediately, I must object to this situation. Amelia has a clear conflict of interest in evaluating our company. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Then you understand why this is inappropriate, Harold pressed. Actually, Thomas replied, I find her analysis remarkably objective given the circumstances. Every concern she's raised is thoroughly documented and follows our standard evaluation criteria. Harold's face flushed. This is a family matter now. Amelia is deliberately undermining our company after being denied a position she wasn't qualified for. The room fell silent. I felt all eyes on me, waiting for an emotional reaction. Instead, I clicked to my final slide. Morgan Industries requires significant improvement in these key performance areas within 60 days, I stated professionally. Failure to meet these benchmarks will result in contract termination and transition to alternative suppliers. You can't do that, which is precisely why these issues are so concerning, I responded. The $60 million annual contract represents nearly 40% of your revenue. Its termination would be devastating to Hartwell Precision. Bradley leaned forward. What specific improvements are you requiring? I outlined the benchmarks: 98% quality acceptance rate, on-time delivery for 95% of shipments, cost structure realignment to within 5% of industry averages. These are reasonable expectations, Bradley said quietly, earning a glare from Harold. They're punitive, Harold countered, and clearly influenced by personal animosity. I maintained eye contact with him. 6 months ago, you told me I wasn't qualified to work at Hartwell Precision. You questioned my experience, my capabilities, and my value, despite my education and industry background. You chose family politics over merit. I gestured to the data displayed behind me. But qualifications matter in business relationships. Performance matters. And based on objective metrics, Hartwell Precision is failing to meet the qualifications necessary to maintain our business relationship. Bradley surprisingly spoke up again. She's right about the metrics, Dad. I've been flagging these issues in our internal meetings for months. Harold shot his son a warning look before turning back to me. This is family betrayal, plain and simple. No, I replied firmly. This is business. The kind of business grandfather built on quality, reliability, and honest value. Perhaps if you'd allowed qualified individuals to contribute regardless of personal feelings, Hartwell wouldn't be in this position. Thomas intervened before Harold could Harold attempted to negotiate. We could discuss pricing concessions in exchange for a longer improvement timeline. The timeline isn't negotiable, Thomas stated. Continued performance issues are already impacting our production schedules. We've prepared contingency plans for transition to alternative suppliers if necessary. After another 30 minutes of discussion, mostly focused on specific improvement requirements, Harold grudgingly agreed to the terms. As the meeting concluded, he pulled me aside. Your father will hear about this, he said in a low voice. The family won't look kindly on what you've done today. What I've done, I replied calmly, is my job. With integrity and based on merit. Perhaps that's something to consider at Hartwell as well. As they left, Bradley lingered behind. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think you're right about the problems. And I'm sorry about how the director position was handled. I nodded acknowledgement, but offered no absolution. Bradley had benefited from the same nepotism that had excluded me, even if he now recognized its consequences. After the Hartwell team departed, Thomas clasped my shoulder. That couldn't have been easy. You handled it professionally. Thank you for your support, I said. The data supported your position, he replied simply. That's all that matters here. As I gathered my materials, I felt oddly calm. There was no vindictive satisfaction, no triumph in Harold's discomfort. Just the quiet confidence of knowing I had done my job well, based solely on the merits. In the end, that was the only validation I truly needed. The family fallout began within hours. By evening, my phone was buzzing constantly with messages from various relatives. My mother called first, her voice tight with anxiety. There's an emergency family meeting at your grandparents' house tonight, she said. Harold is furious. He says you blindsided him at Morgan Industries. I was doing my job, Mom. I know, sweetheart, but this is complicated. Please just come. Your father needs your support. I arrived at my grandparents' old Victorian house, now maintained as a family gathering place, to find most of the extended family already assembled in the formal living room. Conversations hushed as I entered. Aunt Margaret gave me a cold look. Uncle Walter nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Harold stood as soon as he saw me. Here she is, the saboteur herself. Harold, my father warned, rising from his seat. No, Lawrence, this needs to be addressed, Harold continued. Your daughter has deliberately undermined our family business. She's threatening to cancel our largest contract out of spite. I remained calm, feeling all eyes on me. Morgan Industries is evaluating all vendor contracts based on performance metrics. Hartwell's metrics have been declining for over a year. This is standard business practice, not personal. You specifically requested to handle our account, Harold accused. I was assigned to evaluate our top 5 vendors, including Hartwell, I corrected. And I disclosed my family connection to Morgan's management immediately upon hiring. My mother twisted her hands anxiously. Surely there's a way to work this out. We're family. That's exactly my point, I replied. Families should hold each other to higher standards, not lower ones. Grandfather built Hartwell on excellence. Harold scoffed. Don't lecture me about what Edward built. I've been running this company successfully for 15 years. Have you? My father's quiet question silenced the room. For years, he had avoided direct confrontation with Harold. Now he stood, shoulders squared. The reports Amelia presented today show serious operational problems. Problems I've been pointing out in board meetings for months, only to be dismissed. Typical Lawrence, Aunt Margaret interjected. Always complaining instead of contributing solutions. I've submitted detailed solution proposals for every issue I've raised, my father countered. Harold has filed each one without implementation. Check the board records. Bradley, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Dad, Lawrence is right. We have been ignoring quality control warnings. The rejection rate has tripled in the last year. Harold turned on his son. You're siding with them now? I'm stating facts, Bradley replied. Facts that could cost us our biggest contract if we don't address them immediately. The family argument escalated, with accusations flying from all directions. Aunt Margaret attacked my loyalty. Uncle Walter tried to mediate. Cousins took sides based on parent alignment rather than facts. Through it all, I maintained my professional demeanor, repeatedly bringing the conversation back to the performance metrics rather than personalities. This isn't about who runs Hartwell, and you're just the impartial judge of that, Harold said sarcastically. The data is the judge, I corrected. Morgan has documented every quality failure, every missed delivery, every cost increase. These aren't subjective evaluations. As the debate continued, something unexpected happened. Bradley began supporting my points, confirming operational issues I'd identified. Uncle Walter, typically reluctant to challenge Harold directly, started asking pointed questions about quality control procedures. Even some of Harold's staunchest supporters looked concerned as the extent of the problems became clear. What Harold isn't telling you, my father said during a momentary lull, is that Hartwell has been losing other customers too. Smaller ones that don't make headlines, but they add up. This isn't just about Morgan Industries. Harold glared at my father. That's confidential business information. I'm on the board, Harold. I see the monthly reports you try to bury in appendices. Customer retention has dropped 20% in 2 years. This revelation shifted the mood in the room. Family members looked between Harold and my father, reassessing the situation. Is this true, Harold? Uncle Walter asked quietly. Harold's silence was answer enough. The conversation gradually transformed from accusation to problem-solving. Bradley admitted he had been promoted beyond his capabilities and was struggling to manage quality control effectively. My father revealed Harold's gradual takeover tactics that had concentrated decision-making power while diluting accountability. We need outside help, Uncle Walter finally concluded. Independent consultants to evaluate our operations and recommend improvements. And a temporary leadership restructuring while we implement changes, my father added. More distributed authority based on expertise rather than ownership percentage. Harold objected strenuously, but he was increasingly isolated as family members absorbed the seriousness of the situation. A vote was called. To Harold's visible shock, the family voted overwhelmingly for the proposed changes, with only Aunt Margaret and 2 cousins siding with him. This is a temporary measure, Uncle Walter assured Harold, to address the immediate crisis. You're still CEO, but key operational decisions will require consensus from a newly formed executive committee. Harold left abruptly after the vote, Aunt Margaret trailing behind offering consolation. The remaining family members broke into smaller groups, discussing implications and next steps. My father approached me, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. You did what I should have done years ago. Stood up to him with facts rather than emotion. I was just doing my job, I said for what felt like the 100th time that day. No, he contradicted gently. You were honoring your grandfather's legacy the way I failed to do. By demanding excellence rather than accepting mediocrity for the sake of peace. Over the following weeks, Hartwell Precision underwent significant changes. They hired a respected industry consultant to evaluate their operations. Bradley stepped down from quality control to work under a more experienced director. My father took a more active role in operations management, while Harold focused primarily on client relationships, his strongest skill. Weekly progress meetings between Morgan Industries and Hartwell showed gradual improvement. Quality rejection rates began to decline. Delivery schedules stabilized. Cost structures were reviewed and adjusted. I maintained By the 5th week, the improvement was noticeable enough that Thomas commented on it. Whatever they're doing over there is working. The numbers are trending in the right direction. They have good people, I acknowledged. They just needed better systems and more appropriate leadership roles. As the 60-day deadline approached, I prepared my evaluation with mixed emotions. Part of me had feared Hartwell wouldn't improve enough, forcing a contract termination that would devastate the company. Another part had feared they would improve, but Harold would claim full credit and resume his old patterns once the crisis passed. The reality fell somewhere in between. Hartwell had made significant progress, but still had work to do. And the changes in leadership structure were proving beneficial beyond just addressing Morgan's concerns. Other customer relationships were improving as well, according to my father's cautious updates during our weekly dinners. Most surprisingly, Bradley had emerged as an advocate for continued reform, having apparently recognized the limitations of his previous role and embraced a position better suited to his actual experience level. It was a humility I hadn't expected from Harold's son, and it gave me hope for Hartwell's future. The final review meeting took place exactly 60 days after our initial confrontation. This time, the Hartwell team arrived with confidence rather than defensiveness. Harold, Bradley, my father, and the new quality control director, Diana Parker, entered the conference room together. I began the presentation with updated performance metrics. Quality acceptance had improved from 82% to 96%. On-time delivery had risen from 78% to 93%. Cost structure adjustments had brought pricing within 7% of industry averages, with a clear path to further alignment. While not quite meeting all our targets, I concluded, Hartwell Precision has demonstrated substantial improvement and clear commitment to resolving the identified issues. Thomas nodded approval. Based on these results and your recommendation, Morgan Industries is prepared to renew our contract with Hartwell Precision with quarterly performance reviews for the first year. The relief in the room was palpable. My father smiled slightly. Bradley looked genuinely pleased. Even Harold managed a professional nod of acknowledgement. We appreciate Morgan's patience during this improvement process, Harold said formally. And we commit to maintaining these new standards moving forward. Diana presented their ongoing quality. As the Hartwell team prepared to leave, Bradley approached me separately. I wanted to thank you, he said quietly, not just for giving us this chance, but for forcing us to confront problems we were ignoring. You saved the business, whether Dad will admit it or not. I was surprised by his candor. You played a significant role in the improvements yourself. He shrugged. Only after accepting I wasn't qualified for my previous position. That was a hard pill to swallow, but ultimately the right medicine. After they departed, Thomas called me into his office. Exceptional work managing this situation, Amelia, particularly given the personal complications. Thank you for trusting me with it. Trust that's been well earned, he replied. Which brings me to my next point. We're creating a new Director of Vendor Strategy position. The role would oversee our entire supplier network, focusing on long-term partnerships and strategic alignment. I'd like you to consider it. The offer stunned me. That's a significant promotion. Based on merit, Thomas emphasized. Your handling of the Hartwell situation demonstrated exactly the skills we need. Professional judgment, data-driven decision-making, and the ability to navigate complex relationships productively. I accepted the position with genuine gratitude, recognizing it as validation of everything I'd worked for professionally. The qualities my grandfather had seen in me years ago were now recognized and valued by others based solely on my performance. The family dynamics shifted gradually over the following months. Hartwell Precision continued its broader transformation, implementing new practices across all departments. The distributed leadership model proved more effective than Harold's centralized control had been, with decisions now made by those with relevant expertise rather than just positional authority. Bradley and I developed an unexpected professional respect. He occasionally sought my advice on vendor relationship management, acknowledging my expertise without the defensiveness his father still sometimes displayed. He had found his own path within the company, one based on his actual skills rather than entitlement. Harold remained somewhat distant, but the open hostility had faded. At industry events where our paths crossed, we maintained professional courtesy. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of reluctant respect in his interactions with me, particularly when discussing Morgan's supplier requirements with other vendors present. The most significant healing occurred in the broader family context. Sunday dinners at my parents' house gradually resumed, initially tense but increasingly comfortable as the business situation stabilized. My mother's relief at the reduced conflict was evident in her renewed energy and humor. During Thanksgiving dinner at my grandparents' old house, now a neutral ground for family gatherings, I found myself seated next to Uncle Walter. As the table buzzed with multiple conversations, he leaned over to speak privately. Your grandfather would be proud, he said, his voice carrying the weight of years alongside Edward Hartwell. Not just of your professional success, but of how you handled this situation. You forced necessary change without destroying what he built. Thank you, I replied, unexpectedly moved by his words. That means a great deal coming from you. He always said you had the mind for business, Walter continued. But what he meant was you had the integrity for it too. The willingness to make hard decisions based on facts rather than feelings. Later that evening, as family members gathered in smaller groups for coffee and dessert, Harold approached me in the kitchen, where I was helping my mother with dishes. Morgan renewed the full contract, he said without preamble. Thomas mentioned your recommendation was instrumental in that decision. I nodded, unsure where this was heading. That was professionally handled, he continued, the closest thing to a compliment he had offered in years. The company is stronger for the changes we've implemented. I'm glad to hear that, I replied sincerely. He hesitated, then added, you would have been qualified for the director position. That was a misjudgment on my part. The acknowledgement, however belated, closed a chapter one hadn't realized was still open. Not because I needed his validation anymore, but because it represented growth on his part, a willingness to acknowledge error that had previously seemed impossible. As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The rejection that had initially seemed devastating had led me to a position far better suited to my skills and interests. The confrontation that had risked family relationships had ultimately strengthened them through necessary truth-telling. My grandfather had been right about my aptitude for business, but he couldn't have predicted how that journey would unfold. Sometimes the wrong door closes so the right one can open. Sometimes rejection redirects you exactly where you need to be. In my new role at Morgan Industries, I was building something meaningful on my own terms, defined by merit rather than family connection. And ironically, that independence had given me the platform to help preserve my family's legacy in a way that working directly for Hartwell never could have. The qualification that truly mattered wasn't listed on any job description or resume. It was the courage to stand by your principles, to demand excellence regardless of personal cost, and to recognize that true respect must be earned rather than inherited. If you've ever faced rejection that later proved to be redirection to something better, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Have you experienced a situation where standing your ground professionally affected personal relationships? How did you handle it? Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life stories, and share with someone who might need to hear that sometimes rejection is just redirection in disguise. Thank you for listening to my journey.